The Leader of the Opposition. Thank you, Mr. President. I believe I'll be the last speaker from the non-government parties. I've followed the debate intently in my office this evening. I've listened to all of the contributions. It is unfortunate that to date no member of the government has spoken in this debate to put a case for the bill. I note that there's been much talk of rights tonight, and numerous speakers have made the point that this bill's title is Orwellian, in that it's a bill that strips rights, in our view, from the victims of crime, yet is titled in part Victims' Rights. There's been lots of talk about rights. I want to introduce a new word, that's dignity. Because I think, for all the talk of human rights, that the root of human rights are to be found in the dignity that belongs to every human being. The dignity that's inherent in human life and equal in every person. And I'm sure Reverend Niall would agree with me that that human dignity has been given by God. And that human dignity, after having been given by God and wounded by sin, was taken and redeemed by Jesus Christ in his death and resurrection. The dignity of every person before God is the basis of the dignity of man before other men. That is a view of humanity and people's dignity that Reverend Niall and the Honourable Paul Green and I all share. And so for all the talk of rights, there's many of us who understand that for all the abstract talk of rights, human rights derive from human dignity and the proper dignity of every human being. And only that recognition of human dignity can make possible the common and the personal growth of all human beings, of everyone. And I've always believed that to stimulate that kind of personal growth that I talked about, it's necessary in particular to help the least. Pope Paul VI taught us that, amongst many other popes. And you know, it's often fashionable in the labour movement to characterise people from the Conservative parties as heartless, as lacking in compassion, as drawing some satisfaction or enjoyment from trampling on the downtrodden. I mean, I just think that's wrong. I think that the overwhelming majority of people who enter public life, who enter Parliament, do so because they want to advance the welfare of the community and the welfare of people. And you know, I think it's trite really to say that people from right-wing parties get their kicks out of trampling on the downtrodden. I think we have to look beyond those sort of cliches and consider people's motivations and parties' motivations and governments' motivations far more seriously than that. I know the Honourable Greg Smith to be a compassionate person.
Very compassionate.
I know him to be a good person. I don't know how he can bring himself to introduce this bill. I disagree with what he's done here in introducing this bill to the Parliament.
By necessity.
But I don't believe it's because he's some vicious, heartless person. But I do think that the last people you'd engage to create a bill that responds to people's physical and psychological scarring, a loss of their human dignity as victims of crime, the last people you'd engage to address that would be a bunch of accountants and auditors. I met with a group of people from the Homicide Victim Support Group earlier this week. And you know, one of the great things about being a Member of Parliament is we so often meet people and groups who teach us so much. And I learnt things in that meeting on Monday with Martha Jabor and the people she brought in. And one of the things they taught me was it's not just about rights, it's about the dignity of people and the loss of human dignity when there's obviously a loss of life when someone's murdered. But their family members, their loved ones are victims of that crime too. And it's not, when I say they're victims, I'm not talking about their rights in the first instance, I'm talking about their dignity and what it does to them as the spouse or a child or a parent of someone who's murdered. And in attempting to deal with that assault on their dignity, legislators have to recognise that those people's needs are not just financial. They have emotional needs. People are scarred for years and decades after a murder of a loved one. They do have financial needs. They do need money to keep them going in their lives. There's people who can often barely get out of bed because of the scarring, because of the assault on their dignity, because of what that crime has done in not only taking the life of a family member, but what it's done to them as a loved one of that murder victim. So there's a loss of dignity. There's so much talk about rights in politics, but let's start with the concept of the equal dignity of all human beings. And you know, I think about Martha Jabor and I think about retired Assistant Commissioner John Laycock and the work they do assisting the loved ones of homicide victims. And I mean, these people are secular saints, really, you know, because what they're doing is reaching down to tend the wounds and bind them and pick up and extend a hand to the most damaged, most scarred members of our community. Homicide doesn't discriminate. It has no boundaries. It has no limits. It doesn't make exceptions. It cuts across all social, religious, class and ethnic boundaries. I mean, homicide can be so random. It can be so random. It can't be right that, it just can't be right that a government, through whatever torturous mechanisms, finds itself in a position that very large tax concessions are given to the clubs industry, that very significant cuts to the fees paid by thousands of private jetty owners are given, and at the same time there's these very large cuts to victims' rights, to the financial payments to the victims of crime, to people who've suffered such an assault on their dignity as human beings. It can't be right. Now, I don't think we've got there because Liberals and Nationals are cruel, heartless Tory bastards. I don't think that at all. I understand that you know, individual decisions are taken at different times and budgets are put together and so on. But just step back for a second. It just cannot be right that thousands of private jetty owners receive a 36% cut in the fees they pay, that very large clubs doing very well receive massive tax concessions, and the government that's taken those decisions serves up this bill that slashes payments and support for victims of crime. It just can't be right. We need to think about that. I've talked about the Liberals and Nationals. I want to, through you, Mr. President, speak to Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile and to the Honourable Paul Green. Fred, I think Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile was unfairly harsh on my part. I'm not going to respond to that. I think he and his colleague are in a very difficult position. It happens to them often. When you have the balance of power, there's an awesome responsibility that goes with that. They're standing in the middle of a conflict between government and opposition. They're hearing the pleas from people who, many of whom are desperate. There's a natural inclination from the Christian Democratic Party to support the government of the day on major legislation, whether that's a Labor government or a Liberal National government. I understand.
And as you know, we did that with the Labor government.
I do acknowledge that, Fred. I do acknowledge that.
Often under severe attacks.
Indeed. And I understand the difficult position you're in. But I do think this is a bridge too far, and I do think you ought to sleep on it, and I do think we ought to come back tomorrow and see if we can do better as a House of Review. And, you know, I've been to the Holy Land with the pair of you gentlemen, and that was a great time we had together. And I've been in Jerusalem with you, and I want to share this story, and both of you will know it well. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." You know that's the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke's Gospel. And when Jesus said, "Love your neighbour as yourself," he illustrated it with that parable, that we have an obligation, we have a duty to help the least of our brothers, those in most trouble. There are no people in greater need in our society than victims of crime. There's no people in greater need in our society than the relatives, the grieving relatives of homicide victims. The parable of the Good Samaritan tells us about a victim of crime and how Jesus sought that he be treated. I don't say this to the Honourable Paul Green and to Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile to embarrass them or shame them in any way. You, gentlemen, and I share the same faith. We've been to the Holy Land together. We've been to Jerusalem together. I ask that you consider the parable of the Good Samaritan. I know you've done your best this week to get concessions out of the government. I respectfully say to you that I don't believe the concessions that you've admirably wrought out of the government go far enough. I believe we as a House ought to be able to do better. I think we ought to sleep on it, come back tomorrow and see if we can do better. See if we can do better for the least of our brothers, the people who need compassion and love and support and a helping hand more than any other group in society. Victims. Let's not just consider their rights. Their rights are important, but their dignity as people is absolutely non-negotiable, absolutely paramount, must be. Mr. President, I move that this debate be now adjourned until the next sitting day.